Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to the All Me podcast. My name is Tavis Piatoli, sports dietitian with the Taylor Hooten Foundation. Today, I'm going to be your host. Are you someone who struggles with consuming enough fluids each day? Do you know how much fluid you need to stay hydrated and the benefits that are associated with it? Also, have you ever wondered what electrolytes are important, what their functions are, and when you should consume them in a beverage? Our partners at Gatorade have spent over 50 years studying hydration, sweat rates, and electrolytes in active individuals and athletes. And in this podcast, I speak with Dr. Lindsay Baker from the Gatorade Sports Science Institute to learn more about our hydration and electrolyte needs. We'll also discuss the key electrolytes that are important for hydration and their function, how important hydration is for the body, and the signs and symptoms of dehydration. Dr. Baker is the Senior Principal Scientist at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute and also the Research and Development Fellow with PepsiCo. Since joining GSSI in 2007, Lindsay's primary role has been designing and conducting sports nutrition, hydration, and sweat studies for the GSSI research program. Originally from Saxton, Pennsylvania, Lindsay came to GSSI from the Pennsylvania State University, where she earned a doctorate degree in Kinesiology. While at Penn State, she conducted hydration and thermoregulation research at Noll Laboratory under the mentorship of Dr. Larry Kenney. Lindsay has over 40 publications in sports hydration and nutrition, including peer-reviewed manuscripts and invited reviews and book chapters. She is a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine and is on the scientific advisory board for the Korey Stringer Institute. Lindsay earned her Bachelor of Science degree in biology with a minor in chemistry at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown. We'd also like to thank our partners at Gatorade for sponsoring this podcast. Dr. Baker, welcome to the All Me podcast. It's great to have you.
Hi, it's great to be with you.
This is going to be a real exciting topic. I know as a sports dietitian, I get a lot of questions at our programs around hydration, electrolytes, what to do. I mean, I'm in the New Orleans area. When I played football, I know this is an area where we struggled with when it comes to hydrating athletes. So I'm really excited to kind of learn more about what we're going to talk about. Before we get started and diving deeper, let's learn a little bit about you as, your background. The first thing I want to kind of get an idea about you is really, and our listeners are going to want to know is, what was your career path and what interested you in the field of sports nutrition, specifically studying hydration and electrolyte needs?
Yeah, so growing up, I loved sports, running, basketball, baseball, football, all sports really. I was one of those kids who lived, breathed, and dreamed about sports. And my favorite subjects in school were math and science. I was curious about how things work, and in particular, I wanted to better understand human physiology and performance. And if there were things that I could do as an athlete from a training or a nutrition perspective to improve my own sports performance. So my career path is really a natural merging of my two passions. And by the time I was in high school, I knew I wanted to get into exercise science, specifically exercise physiology. So first I went to the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown, where I studied biology and chemistry for my bachelor's degree. And later I earned a PhD in kinesiology at Penn State. When I was at Penn State, I came to realize my passion for research, particularly research that has a direct practical application in helping athletes. My advisor, Dr. Larry Kenney, was doing hydration research for GSSI at the time while he was at Penn State. And so that gave me the opportunity to get into this area of research. And I really enjoyed it, largely because it was something that I felt I could relate to. And I think a lot of people can relate to this topic area. Just about everyone can relate to or has experienced firsthand the negative effects of heat stress and dehydration on their health and wellness. And every athlete, I'm sure, has felt the effects of on their sports performance. So in the end, I gravitated toward a career focused on understanding hydration and thermoregulation and developing knowledge and solutions really to help athletes manage these challenges.
Yeah, that's a great career path, and really interesting how, and I've always wanted to know how people choose the career they get into. For myself, it was completely opposite. I wanted to be a pediatrician and then showed up into the world of sports nutrition. So it's kind of weird how we get to where we are. As a scientist, what is your day-to-day, work schedule like? Do you stay in the same location? Do you go out and do things in the field? Kind of give us a little overview of what that looks like.
Yeah, so every day is different, quite different, which is part of what makes my job really fun. I oversee our hydration research program, so I design studies. I oversee the team of scientists conducting the studies, analyze the data coming in, and report the results to internal stakeholders within GSSI and PepsiCo. And I also write up the results in publications in scientific journals. I'm also passionate about knowledge sharing and mentoring. So I'm involved in different programs within PepsiCo to help advise my colleagues on best practices around things like study design and technical writing. And another part of my job is translating the science to practice, for example, regarding hydration advice and sports nutrition recommendations. This is usually in the form of, for example, presentations to coaches and athletic trainers at different venues or conferences. I also like to stay very active and engaged in different sports medicine organizations and scientific committees. So I present our research, for example, at the American College of Sports Medicine, and also represent GSSI in collaborations with various groups on education initiatives around hydration and heat safety. So a lot of variety, which some days I spend most of the time in front of the computer. Other days I might be in the field or traveling to conferences or other venues talking directly to people about hydration and heat stress.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, so it sounds like you stay really, really busy on a regular basis. A lot of variety, like you said, variety is so important in this process. If we just did the same thing every day, I think we'd get really bored. So especially in the field of science, as you know, our field changes every single day, week, month. So it's always keeps us on our toes to stay on top of that research. So let's talk about the problem, which is dehydration. First of all, explain to our listeners, what is dehydration and what are some factors that can cause someone to be dehydrated?
Sure. So dehydration is simply the result of more fluid leaving the body through sweating, for example, for athletes, than is being put back into the body through drinking. So it's just really an issue of simply fluid imbalance, right? So this sort of begs the question, why do we sweat in the first place and, need to lose those fluids from the body? Well, during exercise, a lot of heat is generated by the working muscles. This is called metabolic heat production, of course, which makes your body core temperature increase. Then if you add warm weather on top of it, you can have even higher increases in core temperature. Now, the body wants to maintain some kind of thermal balance and prevent significant dangerous increases in body core temperature. So to maintain thermal balance, the main mechanism by which humans dissipate that body heat, especially during exercise, is through evaporation of sweat. So large sweat losses and inadequate fluid intake to offset those losses, that sort of combination is the main cause of dehydration in athletes.
Now, we know when it comes to dehydration, especially when it gets really severe, there are some signs and symptoms we need to look for, especially for individuals that, whether they're athletes or not, they could be just on the field training hard or at work or cutting grass. I remember my dad one time, he felt exhausted and just felt tired to where I thought something was wrong because he was out in the sun all day. So what are some of the signs and symptoms of dehydration we need to look out for?
Yeah, there were three really practical things that everyone should consider when monitoring dehydration. And those three things are simply thirst, urine, and that is urine color and urine frequency, and body weight. It's best to consider all three of these together because individually there are limitations in how effective these markers are in telling you how hydrated you are at a given point in time, especially in real world situations outside of a controlled laboratory. So first is the sensation of thirst. This is your body's signal to you that your blood is concentrated because of a decrease in body water. So it's basically your brain telling you that you need to bring on board water to restore normal concentration levels in your blood plasma. So that should be no surprise that, thirst is a good signal, a sign of dehydration. Also, when you're dehydrated, your body will try to limit fluid loss through urine. So your urine volume and the frequency in which you need to empty your bladder will decrease throughout the day. And the color of the urine will be darker because there's not much water in it, so it's simply concentrated. And finally, exercise-induced dehydration can be monitored through body weight loss. This is because during exercise, almost all of the body weight that we lose is from sweating. So say you weigh yourself, ideally nude or with minimal clothing, for accuracy, before exercise, and you are 150 pounds. And then after your activity, say you go out for a 90-minute jog or run or something like that, or a pickup game of basketball, you weigh yourself again after that workout, and you are now 147 pounds. You've lost 3 pounds, or 2% of your body weight, because of dehydration. Overall, the goal is to drink enough fluid to avoid significant dehydration, which most scientists would define as that 2% body weight loss. But at the same time, you also want to take care to avoid over drinking to the point where you gain weight during your workout. And your urine should be a light yellow color. We usually say like lemonade. Lemonade is good, but not dark like apple juice. And certainly also not clear like pure water either. So you want to avoid both extremes.
Interesting. And that's the easy way. If I'm talking to young athletes, it's like, hey, let's look at it as lemonade. We don't want this stuff to look like apple juice. And that's easy for them to kind of remember. That's good. That's great information, and good information kind of on the signs and symptoms and really ways to monitor that. Now, let's talk about really the impact on someone's performance or health. How does, I don't think a lot of athletes understand, if they're dehydrated, this can impact performance, but to what degree? But also just for the general population, how does this impact their health?
Yeah, so it's important to realize that your blood is approximately 50% water. This portion of the blood is called the plasma, while the other, about 50% of blood, is the cells. So when there's a decrease in body water, there's a decrease in plasma volume, which in turn impacts blood flow to vital organs. For example, muscles, which, as you can imagine, affects exercise performance. Dehydration impacts blood flow to the skin, which in turn limits your ability to dissipate heat from your body. And dehydration also impacts blood flow to the brain. So this is why you may feel sluggish, you might feel overheated or dizzy when you get dehydrated, especially if you're exposed to heat stress as well.
Yeah, and that's what I remember. My dad was like, "Look, I feel lightheaded. And I was young, so I didn't really know what those signs and symptoms were." And in Louisiana, with the humidity, it's cutting grass for 3 or 4 hours. It's exhausting, and like you said, if you're not replacing that, it's going to cause some of those factors. When it comes to, let's say, looking at the lack of fluid, besides the lack of fluid consumption, are there other factors that could contribute to someone being dehydrated? Let's say if they consume way too much caffeine, take medication, or anything else.
Sure. So diuretic-based medications cause increased urine loss, yes. And another factor is illness, which can cause, obviously depending on the severity, can cause significant fluid losses through, other avenues like vomiting or diarrhea. So athletes need to take the appropriate amount of time to recover and rehydrate after an illness and not just jump right back into their workouts. They need to make sure that they're truly rehydrated and ready to go before returning to their sport. And yes, you mentioned caffeine. Caffeine is a mild diuretic, so it may increase short-term urine production while sitting around at rest. But this is one of those things where, contrary to popular belief, several studies have actually shown that caffeinated fluids contribute to hydration in a similar manner to non-caffeinated fluids. And importantly, caffeine does not induce diuresis or increase urine loss during exercise. So all in all, mild or moderate caffeine consumption before and during exercise should not necessarily be discouraged on the basis of its potential diuretic effects. Also, caffeine does not compromise rehydration or increase urine output when consumed in small quantities after exercise. And for reference, I mentioned mild to moderate caffeine intake. In the context of these sort of recommendations or guidelines, mild to moderate caffeine intake is approximately 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight. So for that 150-pound person, for example, that would be about 200 milligrams of caffeine. So depending on how strong your coffee is, that would be 1 to 2 cups of coffee. At any rate, the take-home message on caffeine and hydration is that drinks like coffee and tea and others do not hinder hydration as long as the caffeine is consumed in moderation.
Yeah, especially when we look at people drinking energy drinks that could have 300 milligrams per can. Some of these coffee centers we go to today have anywhere from 300 to 500 milligrams depending on the size. So it could be easy where some of these people are consuming a few thousand milligrams of caffeine a day, combined with a lack of fluid consumption, combined with a lot of heat. That can cause some problems, I would think.
Yeah, I would agree. The key is, everything in moderation. So as long as they stick to that, 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, they shouldn't have to worry about it causing dehydration. But when you get above that level, then that's definitely a watch out.
We talked about the hot environment, especially where I live in Louisiana and right outside New Orleans, and especially training in those hot environments. What are some of the biggest concerns with training in a hot and humid environment? And does this increase our risk for being dehydrated?
Remember earlier I talked about evaporation of sweat being very important for body temperature regulation. The key factor in this cooling process is that the sweat has to evaporate from the skin for the cooling to be effective. Now, water evaporates readily in a dry environment because there's a large gradient or difference in the vapor pressure between the sweat on your skin and the moisture level in the air. But when the air is very moist, very humid, much of the sweat will just drip off the body, which is really wasted water loss because it's not very effective in cooling the body. So this is why exercise in a hot and humid environment feels more difficult. Because your body is having a hard time trying to dissipate or get rid of that heat load. The same concept and the same issues actually apply to athletes like, say, football players or laborers or warfighters who have to wear protective gear or equipment, lots of clothing that covers most of their skin and prevents evaporation of sweat. And so this is one of the reasons that wearing protective gear, lots of extra clothing makes it especially difficult or potentially even dangerous to exercise in the heat.
Yeah, and I know some athletes have just struggled with that, or just individuals in general when it comes to certain temperatures, and great way to, explain that when it comes to the heat dissipation. Now let's shift to, we've talked a lot about dehydration. I want to shift a little bit now to fluid needs. I think that's a big question I get is, how much should I be consuming, or, what's an important amount of fluid based on, I guess, body weight or anything like that? So my first question is, without exercise or activity, how much fluid should someone consume in a day?
Well, the USDA does provide general guidelines for water intake. They define adequate intake for total water as 125 ounces per day for men and 91 ounces per day for women. These amounts include water intake from food too. So we actually get about 20% or so of our total water from food. So remember that counts towards water intake too. But with these guidelines, it's important to keep in mind that they are simply guidelines. There is really no one size fits all type of answer to this question, unfortunately, about how much fluid is appropriate for each individual person. It varies depending on body size. And even without much physical activity, your fluids might vary depending upon the climate you live in, or even from season to season, depending on how much time you spend outside. just because of that additional sweat losses occurring as a result of the heat stress, even if you're not very active. Yeah, in any case, the same principles that I mentioned previously apply here in determining how much fluid you need to drink to maintain hydration. You need to take in enough fluid to offset your fluid losses. So you need to monitor your hydration needs by being cognizant of those practical measures that I talked about earlier: thirst, urine, and body weight changes.
Yeah, those are three really important things, and they'll be in the show notes, guys, so we'll have that information in there for you as well if needed as a reference. We've talked about some of the side effects and of being dehydrated. Let's focus on the benefits of hydration. What are some of the key things that being hydrated helps an individual?
Yeah, so in addition to the benefits for athletes and performance and regulating body temperature that I've been talking about, hydration is also important for general health. Body water makes up about 50 to 70% of the human body, depending on your body composition and age and things like that. So it is a really important nutrient for the body, and in fact, important for many different components or systems within the body to function properly. For example, water makes up a large percentage of our muscles and bones. We know that hydration is also important for cognitive function. And water plays an important role as a medium to transport vital nutrients to tissues, and is also a medium to remove waste products from the body through the kidneys and urine. We also know that not having enough water on board increases feelings of fatigue and tiredness, and impairs attention and motor coordination just in your everyday life and at work and things like that, regardless of, even if you're not working out. And dehydration has been linked to increased risk of kidney stones, and in extreme situations where people are chronically dehydrating because of doing physical labor for many hours in a hot environment, dehydration has been linked to chronic kidney disease. So all of these effects of dehydration on the body show why staying properly hydrated is really important to avoid those negative effects.
Yeah, it's really critical. Energy and hydration, very, very important for the individual, especially just to maintain that focus throughout the day. Now, Gatorade was not created as a company that provided water. They've been a company that has been known for their electrolytes, and that's kind of where I want to shift my energy now and kind of focusing on the topic of electrolytes. My first question on this topic is really, what are the important electrolytes needed for hydration?
So the key electrolyte for hydration is sodium. This is because sodium is the most abundant ion and the most osmotically active ion in the extracellular space. And what that means is that sodium plays a key role, an important function in dictating water movement into and out of the blood plasma, or again, the water portion of the blood. So sodium helps determine plasma volume, which, if you remember from a previous comment, is really important for cardiovascular function, endurance performance, and regulating body temperature in hot weather. Sodium is also really important for making sure that your body holds on to the fluid that you drink instead of losing it through urination. This is important, especially when you're trying to rehydrate quickly and completely after exercise, and because you have another workout that you need to do in a few hours. Like if you're a football player in a summer training camp doing 2-a-day practices, or you're a tennis player doing tournament competition, or a baseball player in a doubleheader. There's lots of examples, but that's when rehydrating with electrolytes to hold on to your fluid that you're drinking is really important.
Absolutely. I've had a lot of athletes when I was working as a sports dietitian with teams. We have some that are just really heavy sweaters. Even individuals. I have friends that are like, I look at them, they walk outside for 5 minutes, and I'm like, man, do you need to take a shower? Are you okay? So it kind of leads to my next question about just individuals or athletes in general. Do some of them sweat more and lose more electrolytes than others? And are there certain factors that can impact that, like whether it's body weight, genetics, et cetera?
Yeah, definitely. There's a wide range in sweating rate and sweat sodium concentration among athletes. Again, a lot of it comes down to exercise intensity. The harder your body has to work because of, say, a fast running pace, or the intensity of a football practice, or having to bike uphill, or simply because of larger body size or wearing extra gear, the harder you're working, the more heat the body generates, and therefore the more sweat evaporation is needed to dissipate that heat. The other really important factor is the environment, as we've discussed, and as expected, hotter temperatures result in higher sweating rates. Then there are factors that modify the sweating response beyond, those two main factors of intensity and that other factor is heat acclimation. Over time, say after a week or two of exercising in hot weather, your body starts to adapt to that heat by improving the sweating response in order to keep the body cool. With heat acclimation, you not only sweat more, but you start sweating sooner when exposed to the heat. This, as well as other adaptations, ultimately improve your tolerance to exercise heat stress for a lower risk of heat illness and better performance. This factor, heat acclimation also impacts sweat sodium concentration. After a few days of exercising in the heat, your body starts making adaptations to conserve your sodium losses so that your body can hold on to those important electrolytes. So your sweat becomes less salty than as your body adapts to heat stress.
Now, what about those athletes that are in the water, like say a swimmer, water polo? Because I think the perception is, they're in the water, they're not sweating. It's not as important to stay hydrated. Do they still sweat just because they may not, you may not physically see the sweat on their body?
Yes, they actually do. Even though you can't see it, athletes still sweat when swimming and training in the water and playing, different water sports. But sweat losses are significantly lower in the water than on land, mostly because the water, assuming the water is cooler than skin temperature, which usually it is, it provides convective cooling of the body. So it decreases the requirement or the need for sweating to occur. On average, studies that have measured sweating rates in water sports during swimming, they report sweating rates in the water are about 60 to 70% lower than on land.
That's quite significant. Yeah, I don't think people understand the difference there, but still, it's good information just to kind of have that understanding that, look, even though, because I've worked with swimmers and just people that train in the water, even if it's triathletes, and they still have to rehydrate. I think that's one thing they struggle with because they have limited time between sets and reps. And then, a lot of times they're fatigued by the time they get out. Obviously, they're burning a lot of calories, but, their coaches may not allow them to consume enough fluid throughout that to get that stuff back. So that's good to know. At what point in our training, because I think a lot of questions we get is, when do I need to add electrolytes, to my training? How long does that look like? So at what point in our training do we need to start considering consuming electrolytes? For example, if we do a 30-minute session, do we need electrolytes, or does this really depend on the duration, intensity, and the climate? I know it's a lot of information I threw at you.
Yeah, you're right. It does depend on duration, intensity, and climate. These factors impact the total volume of sweat loss, but it also depends on the individual's sweat sodium concentration, which can range quite broadly, anywhere from 250 to 2,000 milligrams of sodium per 1 liter of sweat, or 1 quart of sweat. This is why personalized sweat testing is recommended by many sports medicine organizations that publish guidelines around fluid and electrolyte replacement during exercise. But yes, in general, the longer and the more intense the exercise and hotter conditions, the greater likelihood of significant sweat electrolyte losses in athletes. Most published guidelines suggest that sodium should be ingested during prolonged exercise lasting about 2 or more hours. And the combination of salty sweats plus prolonged exercise duration is when electrolyte consumption is most useful, such as endurance events or summer training camps for, say, a soccer or football team. Whereas for the person exercising casually or for just 30 minutes a day, they can replace sweat fluid and electrolyte losses with just the regular fluid intake and sodium consumption naturally occurring with their meals and snacks throughout their day.
You mentioned, really those athletes training 2+ hours. That's kind of my next question. For those individuals or athletes that are doing 2+ hours of training in the heat, or even a construction worker, someone who owns a landscaping business that's just outside all day, what are your recommendations for them to replace electrolytes lost in sweat? How can they do that sufficiently throughout the day?
Yeah, and these are really the conditions where replacing electrolytes is important. You can consume electrolytes in a variety of ways. It doesn't always have to be the same way every time or for every person. And what works best for you as an individual depends on things like your preferences, convenience, duration of activity, and whether you may have designated breaks in activity. For example, for athletes, there's different products like sports drinks, gels, chews, and electrolyte packets on the market that we make that are designed for consumption during exercise. And you should stick with sources that you like, that you tolerate well, and you can carry with you. For example, if you're a runner or a cyclist, then you have to take it with you. For construction workers, a lot of the same options apply really as for athletes, but in particular, salty food with water is also a good source because they do have those sort of designated breaks during lunch breaks and maybe even snacks throughout the work shift.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in Louisiana, you get some crawfish, and there's enough sodium in the little batch of crawfish. Because if you look at the back of the powdered crab boil, the entire container has like 300,000 milligrams, and I'm not exaggerating. So, yeah, if you go to a crawfish boil, all of a sudden you feel like, okay, I'm retaining a ton of fluid. I probably will not get dehydrated as long as I keep drinking and eating. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about heavy sweaters. Are there any different recommendations for the heavy sweaters? I've spoken with some athletic trainers who just struggle with some athletes who have trouble getting enough fluid and electrolytes back in their system because they sweat so much. Any recommendations for that population?
Yeah, so this is a common issue that we see as well. Certainly if an athlete's sweating rate is on the upper end of the range, like 2 or 3 liters per hour, it can be really difficult to sort of stomach this volume of fluid, especially during high intensity exercise and in hot weather. There really is a limit to the rate at which the human body can absorb fluids. So there are 2 pieces of advice that we give athletes in this situation. First piece of advice is to make sure that you show up to your practice or your game well hydrated. A lot of athletes just think about hydration as being important in that moment of exercise when they are already hot and sweaty. But if they can, plan ahead and be proactive throughout the day, leading up to the practice, and can at least begin that exercise in an appropriately hydrated state, then they are off to a really good start. Secondly, is that your hydration strategy is something that can be practiced, really, like anything else. We advise heavy sweaters who are struggling with dehydration issues to gradually increase their fluid intake from session to session so that their body can become more accustomed to fluid intake, which may improve stomach comfort. It is important to remember too that heavy sweaters don't need to replace all of their sweat losses. They don't have to replace all 100% of that fluid. The goal should be no more than 2% body weight loss, or if that still is not realistic, at least set a goal to improve from where you're currently at. So say if they are typically losing 4 or even 5% of their body weight, which can happen pretty easily in a 2 to 3 hour workout, then they should maybe make a goal to lose no more than 3%.
Now, we've talked a lot about just all different types of hydration needs for individuals, the heavy sweaters. And I know Gatorade has a lot of products that cover the everyday individual versus the high performance athlete. Are there any specific products that you recommend for those individuals in regards to that are just either sweating a lot or just the everyday person that can just provide general hydration needs?
Yeah, so Gatorade has hydration products with various levels of electrolytes, starting with regular Gatorade, G2, and G0, which are all at the lower end of the range in terms of electrolyte content. In general, these products meet the fluid and electrolyte replacement needs of most active people in most situations. But for athletes who have really salty sweat or participating in endurance events in hot weather and have higher sweat electrolyte losses, we have a product called Gatorade Endurance Formula. This has about double the amount of electrolytes in regular Gatorade. And then we also have Gatorlytes, which is a packet of electrolytes you can put into a bottle of Gatorade, which will give you a solution that has about 4 times the electrolytes of regular Gatorade. Gatorlytes are designed for athletes who are on the very high end in terms of sweat electrolyte losses, like ultra endurance athletes with salty sweat, or perhaps larger football players during summer training camp.
I remember when Gatorade Zero was in the preliminary stage. I saw it at a sports nutrition conference about two to 3 years ago, and I was like, wow, here we go, finally a 0 calorie. I know we had Propel for a while and still do, but really that Gatorade Zero, I think, to me changed the taste, because I was like, wow, this tastes exactly like a sugar-rich Gatorade or a carbohydrate-rich Gatorade, but without the calories, which I think a lot of people like myself who don't need and don't train like high-performance athletes anymore, we want those low-calorie options. So great to see we have those 0 calorie options as well for the everyday individual, because that's important. We talked about sodium being the really most important electrolyte. My next question talks about what's called hyponatremia, which is low blood sodium. And I know that's sometimes a concern for individuals that are probably just consuming way too much water. The Ironman athlete, someone doing an extreme amount of training, or just outside and just drinking water and not replacing electrolytes. Can you discuss the risk of an individual or athlete that could experience hyponatremia, and what type of sports do we commonly see this side effect?
Sure. So hyponatremia occurs primarily as a result, as you said, of gross overdrinking of water or other low sodium fluid at a rate that greatly exceeds the kidney's ability to excrete it. During exercise, the development of hyponatremia is usually associated with excessive overconsumption of fluid that is in excess of sweat losses over a period of activity that is usually more than about 4 hours or so, 4 to 6 hours, such as endurance events, marathons, triathlons, or even ultra events. Other risk factors include things like a slower race pace, probably because there tends to be more opportunity for overdrinking in that situation. And women appear to be more susceptible to hyponatremia because their smaller total body water and smaller plasma volume requires less overdrinking than men to dilute their serum sodium concentration. But exercise-associated hyponatremia also has been reported in American football players, tennis players, and recreational exercisers too, not just endurance athletes. Again, the common theme throughout is excessive overdrinking of low sodium fluids. In some situations, though, heavy salt losses through sweating can exacerbate the risk of developing hyponatremia. So again, this is why it's important for athletes to assess their hydration status by weighing yourself before and after exercise so that you know how much fluid is appropriate for your individual needs. You want to drink enough to avoid significant body weight loss, but not drink so much that you gain weight. And if you've gained weight after your workout, or if you say throughout the day you find yourself going to the bathroom a lot to pee and the urine is clear, then you probably need to cut back on fluid intake.
Yeah, no, that's an important note, and I've had some friends that have struggled with that, not to the point where it got to hyponatremia, but it got pretty close to where they did some extreme events and they felt really, really awful. So that's good recommendations there. Now, the topic I think people probably want to know a lot about, and you see it so often, is just why are athletes cramping, or just cramping in general? I know there's a lot of scientists that study the whole cramping. We're not going to get into what causes all that stuff, but more the electrolytes that are important for it. So are there specific electrolytes that you feel can reduce the risk of cramping?
Yeah. And you're right. The cause of this issue is not clearly understood, and it seems that many factors may be involved. But when cramping occurs during exercise and is associated with heat stress and heavy sweating, it is possible that an electrolyte balance is part of the problem. Electrolyte imbalance is part of the problem. In these situations, whether it is an athlete or a construction worker, oftentimes the consumption of sodium chloride can help mitigate the cramping issues in those cramp-prone individuals.
Outside of, let's say, we talked a lot about sodium. We know sodium and potassium are kind of the key electrolytes that are in a lot of these electrolyte replacement drinks. But where do electrolytes like magnesium and calcium factor into our hydration status? As I've heard from sometimes scientists talk about their potential benefits, and what's the purpose of these minerals or electrolytes?
Yeah, these other electrolytes like magnesium and calcium, as you said, and as well as potassium, They are lost in sweat, but at smaller amounts, actually much smaller amounts than sodium and chloride. As far as their role in hydration, potassium and magnesium are the most abundant electrolytes in the intracellular water space, so the water within the cells. But their exact role or importance in rehydration during or after exercise is not very clear. Some studies suggest they may help a little, others, not so much. On the other hand, the impact of sodium chloride on hydration is very well researched and well documented.
I guess one of the fun things that I like to look at is I've had some friends do some sweat testing for their teams, and I know that's something you guys do quite extensively is sweat test your athletes or go out into the field and sweat test. So how do you test for sweat electrolyte concentration for athletes? What are the mechanisms you use there?
Yeah, so the method we've used for sweat testing in the field the past 20 plus years is called the regional patch technique. It's basically an absorbent pad with a sticky covering that is about the size of a medium Band-Aid. Athletes wear it on their forearm during exercise, and then after exercise, we remove the patch and put the pad that has collected the sweat. We put that in like a centrifuge or maybe even a syringe to squeeze out that small sweat sample. Then we analyze that sample using a benchtop ion chromatography method or more field-friendly, quick, portable ion selective electrode technique to determine sweat sodium concentration. Then we take that data from the forearm and apply a prediction equation to estimate whole body sweat sodium concentration, because that's what's really important, is that whole, extrapolating the forearm information to the whole body. We've done a lot of work in our laboratory at the GSSI Research Hub in Barrington to understand, that relationship between regional and whole body measures of sweat electrolyte concentration. But recently, we've been working on a new patch to measure sweat electrolyte concentration that can be done in real time and avoiding all of those steps, those tedious technical steps I just mentioned about extracting the sweats from the patch and analyzing the sweat sample. These steps, of course, take time. They require specialized equipment and technicians, and therefore the results and recommendations back to the athletes are a bit delayed. So we are in the process of developing and validating the GX sweat patch. It measures sweat chloride concentration using what's called a colorimetric assay. After exercise, the athlete takes a picture of the patch with a camera phone, and the GX app utilizes algorithms that we've developed to interpret the results and provide recommendations back to the athlete based on their sweating rate and sweat electrolyte data. So our method is recently starting to evolve, so it's a bit more, quicker and user-friendly.
Now, last question. I think that's extremely cool, and I love watching technology change just to see how we've come a long way over the last 30, 40 years of assessing athletes in all kind of different ways, whether it's just looking at the biomechanics of an athlete, the sweat, the nutrition. I mean, nutrition has been invested so much money at collegiate and professional levels. Now, last question for you, Dr. Baker, is based on this data from your sweat testing, what does it give you in regards to helping that athlete rehydrate and replace those electrolytes? Do you get like specific amounts to where you say, okay, based on this athlete, hey, they need a certain amount of fluids and electrolytes based on that test?
Yeah, we do give specific information to the athletes so that they have personalized, sweat test results that are then actionable. So sweat testing tells us two things. First, an athlete's sweating rate, which informs how much an athlete needs to drink to stay hydrated. Secondly, it tells us sweat sodium concentration, so how much sodium is in a given volume of sweat. It is important to note that we really need both pieces of information. Knowing just sweat sodium concentration and the absence of data on sweating rate is not as useful as having the whole picture. All of this information, along with knowing the duration of the workout, helps us determine whether or not an athlete is at risk for high electrolyte losses during their workout. Because as we've discussed, these are the scenarios where electrolyte replacement is especially important.
Excellent. I think that's such a fascinating part of our science as we evolve in the world of nutrition. When I talked to Dr. James Carter from the GSSI, the director of GSSI, a few months back, it was a lot of that information is where are we going with science. So it's really good to see, how you guys have evolved as a company, the growth, obviously the products have changed, and really want to thank you for your time today. But before you go, it's time for the fun part of this. We talk a lot about science, and science is fun, but also sometimes it's like, okay, we've talked a lot about science. Let's get to the fun part of this equation, which is our curveball round, where I ask you 3 questions that you have no idea what I'm about to ask you. And one, I was actually taking notes while we were doing this, and I came up with an idea to ask you a question that I've never asked anyone before, but I'm going to save that one to last. Now, you ready for this?
I think so. I hope so.
They're not that bad, but you might have to be like, oh my God, that's what a lot of our guests are like, oh no, this is tough. All right, so first question. If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Oh my gosh.
I was asked this question the other day, and for me, it was like, I just want to fly.
Yeah, honestly, that's exactly what I was going to say. I feel like, my kid, I have 3 kids and 3 young kids, and we, they're always asking me these, just fun questions, the things that go through their mind, theoretical ideas. And yeah, they say, well, what superpower would you like to have? And my answer is always to fly as well. I'm not sure why. I think it's partly because it would allow me to get to where I want to go quickly. Yes. And just have that freedom. The freedom to fly.
To me, it was like the relaxation. I'm just up and above, and I can see everything, and I'm like, wow, I don't have to worry about anything. I can, I have control over the situation. Like you said, I have a 9-year-old that her superpower, and I don't know if it's superpower, she just wants to be she wants to be Taylor Swift. She's like, I want to sing in front of thousands of people. All right, so first question was you want to fly. Number 2, now this is my favorite question because I love music, probably more than just about anything. If you could be the lead singer of any band, who would that be, or what band would that be for?
Well, I love 90s alternative music.
We have a lot.
I don't know. I've never had any desire to, be a singer or be in a band or anything like that. But I love the Counting Crows, so I would have to say I would be in. Yeah, I'd be in the Counting Crows. Yeah.
So it's funny you say that. I sang in I was the singer of a 90s alternative cover band about probably 10 years ago. And I've always been a Pearl Jam, Tool, and, Alice in Chains junkie. So I was like, me would be Pearl Jam. Or if I could sing like Maynard from Tool, it would be that guy. But his range is ridiculous. So it's unbelievable. All right. Last question. I think this is probably going to be the toughest, but it's kind of fun. And I was just like, I need to ask some different things. I usually ask kind of the same ones. But if you could play the lead role in any movie, what would that role be?
Yeah, again, you're asking me things that I've never.
I know, and
no desire to be an actress, but no desire to be an actress. But my favorite movie is Field of Dreams. I love those sports movies that really, make you think and grab your attention. And that one I just really love that movie. And still, it's one of those movies that I can watch over and over again and never get sick of it. So I love, Field of Dreams.
Yep. 2 favorite sports movies for me. Field of Dreams is my favorite baseball, and I love Hoosiers. I think those 2 movies, they're so fun to watch. And, even though they're drama-based, I don't know, like you said, you can watch them over. A buddy of mine posted the other day, he's like, what movie can you watch for 24 hours straight and never get tired of it? And I think, those would be 2 movies from the sports side. So, Dr. Baker, thank you so much for spending an hour of your time with us today. Really greatly appreciate it. Incredible information for our audience, and really hope we get to have you back on in the future one day.
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity. This has been great.
Absolutely. You have a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.